live transcript at the bottom of the screen and click Show Subtitles. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. We are just 9 days away from the Holocaust Center's annual Voices for Humanity virtual luncheon on October 21st. Magda Shalom, a Holocaust survivor who helped to found the Holocaust Center for Humanity and one of the first members of the Holocaust Center Speakers Bureau, settled in Seattle after the Holocaust. Born in Hungary, Magda and her family were deported to Auschwitz, and she remembers arriving on June 21st, 1944. In an interview, she recalled, "I remember the date because that was the date of my brother's birthday, 15 years old. We were so glad that we finally arrived someplace and we could get out of the train and breathe some fresh air." She describes how her mother was sent in one direction and she in another. Magda said in her testimony, "I ran after my mother and they pulled me back and they said, 'She will go to a shower and I will go to a shower and we will be together again.' So I hugged my mother and I kissed her and I said, 'Mom, I'll see you later.' But of course, I never saw my mother again." Magda was the only member of her immediate family to survive. When she arrived in Seattle, she was expected to start a new life and to forget what had happened. Magda was appalled by the rising anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and racism she witnessed around her. She was driven to share her story in the hopes that such atrocities should never happen again. And as such, she became one of the founding members of the Holocaust Center in Seattle. Magda said in an interview, "I feel it is my duty to still talk about the Holocaust." Magda was an active member of the Holocaust Center Speakers Bureau until her death in 2015. She shared her story with thousands of students and adults, and the Holocaust Center continues to share her story today. For 32 years, the Holocaust Center for Humanity has been committed to teaching the lessons of the Holocaust and the difference one person can make. Every day, the Holocaust Center finds new ways to reach students, support survivors and their families, fight anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hatred, and share the stories of the Holocaust. If you believe in what we do, please consider supporting the Holocaust Center. Your donations help us to continue this important work. You can find a link on our website, holocaustcenterseattle.org, where you can donate and register to join the Holocaust Center's virtual luncheon on October 21st. Thank you for your support. The Holocaust Center's museum is open to the public on Sundays, and we invite you to come in and explore the exhibit, Finding Light in the Darkness. In this exhibit, you will have the chance to hear stories from Magda and other local Holocaust survivors. And when you visit, we ask you to consider the land on which you are standing. The Holocaust Center, located in downtown Seattle, sits on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. Thank you to our 2021 Lunch and Learn series sponsors, the Tacoma Jewish Community Fund, Home Street Bank, and the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation. Today's Lunch and Learn program is the fourth in our fall series entitled Connecting the Holocaust to Today. The Holocaust did not happen in isolation. It was not the first genocide nor the last. The Holocaust was one instance in a long human history of persecution, racism, and genocide. And while the Nazis' primary targets were Jewish people, their racist ideology extended to Black Germans, the Roma and Sinti, and other groups they considered undesirable. I'm very honored to have with us today Dr. Emanuela Kucik. Dr. Kucik is an assistant professor of English and Africana Studies and the co-director of the Africana Studies Program at Muhlenberg College. She is also affiliated with the Jewish Studies Program and the Women and Gender Studies Program, and is the faculty advisor to the Black Student Association. Dr. Kucik teaches interdisciplinary courses that examine the intersections of race, genocide, and human rights violations through the study of 20th century and contemporary literature. She is the author of numerous articles and a frequent presenter at conferences. Thank you so much, Dr. Kucik, for being with us today. Dr. Kucik will take questions at the end of the program. Please type them in at any time into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
Thank you so much, Alana, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me into the Holocaust Center for Humanity for all of the incredible work that you do. And thank you so much to Julia and Morgan as well for all of the work that you all have done behind the scenes to make today possible. I am truly honored to be here with all of you. So I'm going to share my screen, and can you all see just the main slide? Actually, I can't see you all, so can someone let me know in the chat if you just see the main slide?
Yes,
okay,
it looks great.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so before I start, I want to note that a lot of the information I'm going to cover today contains descriptions of extreme physical violence, including murder, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual assault. So I completely understand if anyone needs to log off or take time for themselves. Protecting your mental health is the most important thing. So I wanted to let you all know that up front. So today I am honored to be giving a talk entitled "That is 800 Children, Nazi Germany, the United States, and Dismantling Global Anti-Blackness and Racism," which speaks to the theme that Alana so beautifully articulated and the incredible work that the Holocaust Center for Humanity does to dismantle racism across the world. So I'm going to give an overview of the historical relationship between Nazi Germany and anti-Black racism, both in Nazi Germany and in the United States. And so the photos on this title page are of Hans Massaquoi, who is a Black man who grew up in Nazi Germany. And we're going to return to these photos and to his story at the end. The foundational idea behind this talk is that anti-Blackness played a crucial role in the violence of the Holocaust, but the significance of that role and the significance of the role that anti-Blackness has played in violence that has continued around the world in the decades following the Holocaust has largely been erased. In a 1992 article entitled "Forgotten Victims," Holocaust scholar Robert Kesting explains that Hitler included Black people alongside Jewish people in his racist tirades in his autobiography, Mein Kampf. Kesting notes that Hitler was, quote, affected by a worldwide white supremacy movement, which was prevalent prior to World War I and increased in popularity as a result of the political and economic chaos following the war. In the United States, there was a rebirth of the KKK after the war, with membership reaching millions by the mid-1920s, end quote. So this prevalence of anti-Blackness greatly impacted Hitler. And Hitler was also influenced by social Darwinism and what I'm going to call its offspring, which is the eugenics movement. And we're going to discuss that in depth today. So Kesting notes that Hitler, quote, rationalized that someone must be to blame for his perception of world collapse. Supposedly, liberalized and wealthy Jewish people, as well as supposedly parasitic and ignorant Black people, became the scapegoats. Politically, Hitler used anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism to affect the minds of the white European masses, end quote. So in this talk, I aim to discuss the many intersections of anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness that Kesting and so many other scholars have helpfully laid out in their groundbreaking scholarship. In illustrating the centrality of anti-Blackness to global white supremacist systems, my goal is not to downplay anti-Semitism or any other forms of racism or systemic oppression. In no way, shape, or form do I intend to diminish the indisputably central role that anti-Semitism played in the Holocaust as Hitler targeted Jewish populations across Europe. Additionally, I do not want to downplay the Nazis' abuse and murders of members of LGBTQ communities, disabled communities, Romani communities, or the many other people targeted by the Nazis. Rather, I aim to provide an expanded narrative of the Holocaust and of global racialized violence so that we can better understand how systems of oppression intersect with each other and how we can use that knowledge to dismantle those same systems and create a better world for every single citizen of our current world. Genocidal dictators like Hitler rely upon educational systems that try to turn marginalized communities against each other and downplay the connections among the oppressive systems intent upon abusing and murdering them. In showing that these connecting structures all uphold each other, I also aim to emphasize that dismantling one piece of systemic oppression can begin to unravel the others. And I argue that storytelling, particularly storytelling that brings to light stories that have long been ignored, is a crucial component in our continued fight for a just world. These histories are complex, they're multifaceted, and I am only able to provide a small and honestly an incomplete snapshot of all of it in this presentation. But I'm going to try my best, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions and provide further resources in the Q&A or via email afterward. So in terms of the structure of the talk, I like to give people an idea of what's coming. I'm going to start by describing multiple incidents of anti-Black torture, experimentation, and murder to illustrate the stakes of these conversations from the beginning of our time together. Then I will draw back and provide overarching context about the laws, policies, and conditions that allowed those incidents of torture and murder in Nazi Germany to not only exist, but to become the norm for Black populations living during this era. And I will explain the role of the United States in making all of this possible. I will then discuss the connections between the Holocaust and the experiences of Black populations in the United States in the World War II and post-World War II era. And I will conclude with the story of a Black man, Nazi Germany, who lived Hans Massaquoi, who lived not only in Nazi Germany, as I noted with his photos on the title card, but also in the Jim Crow United States. And I close with his story to illustrate the ways these connections played out in the life of one man who made a monumental positive impact on the world through his storytelling, despite the injustices he saw and experienced at the hands of two of the most infamous racist regimes in the world. So since I'm a literary scholar who, as I said, believes in the transformative capabilities of storytelling, perhaps idealistically, but I believe in it nonetheless, and its ability to create empathetic responses that facts alone often cannot, I'm going to open now with the stories of specific people before moving into these broader statistics and information. These opening stories are drawn from Clarence Lussane's groundbreaking 2003 book, Hitler's Black Victims, which I cannot recommend highly enough. Hang on 1 second. Okay. So Hilarius Gilges, sorry, 1 second, this slide. Okay. Hilarius Gilges was a Black German man who was born in 1909. He had a wife, Katerina, and 2 children. He was an anti-Nazi activist who joined the German Communist Youth in 1925 or 1926, and he was an actor and a tap dancer who loved to perform. All of these pieces that comprised Gilges as a whole matter, but the way in which those pieces were shattered, the way in which Gilges's body was physically shattered, tell us more about the period in history during which Gilges lived than almost any other detail about his life can tell us. In June of 1933, Gilges was captured by what historians estimate to have been approximately 6 Nazis, brutally tortured, and then murdered. His body was discovered in the Rhine River the day after his murder in an eerie foreshadowing of the now infamous story of Emmett Till's murder in the United States 22 years later. But unlike Till's story, which was one of the sparks that ignited national protests in what is now known as the United States Civil Rights Movement, Gilges's story was relatively unknown at the time. And honestly, it is almost as unknown now. The anti-Blackness that allowed Gilges's murder continued to flourish in the years that followed. 4 years later, in 1937, hundreds of children of African descent living in the Rhineland, an area of Western Germany, were abducted by Nazis and subjected to horrific medical experiments centered around forcible sterilization. Additionally, hundreds disappeared, which most likely means they were murdered. The Nazis wanted to eliminate these mixed race Black children, whom they called, quote, the Rhineland bastards. So they decided to sterilize them under the 1933 law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. Estimates of how many children were part of these forced sterilizations, medical experimentations, and murders hover between 400 and 800. Mo Abudu, the chief executive of Ebony Life TV, has said that while some might argue that, quotes, in the greater scheme of the Holocaust and how many children perished, 800 mixed race children doesn't sound like a lot, but that is still 800 children. And that is, as you know, the title of this talk. So these images, the first image is Hilarious Gilges. The second is an image of an unidentified child who was classified as one of the Rhineland children and subjected to these experiments. And this article is an article about the, quote, Rhineland bastards. So this rampant anti-Blackness did not only target anti-Nazi activists like Gilges and the Black children of the Rhineland, but it flourished across Europe during the entirety of World War II. And it was such a prominent part of German culture that it extended to the conduct of the German military and produced countless murders of Black people by German soldiers. In his 2005 article, They Are Just Savages, German Massacres of Black Soldiers from the French Army in 1940, scholar Raphael Scheck details horrific massacres of Black French soldiers by German troops in 1940. He explains that when the German army fought in France in June of 1940, May and June of 1940, it encountered a large number of Black African soldiers, and these soldiers had been drafted into the French army. Now, German troops, with some exceptions, treated white French prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which essentially said that you must treat prisoners of war humanely. You cannot torture them, murder them, etc. However, they dealt with Black African soldiers completely differently. In the first quote, Scheck says, let's go back. Okay, in the first quote, he says, in close combat, German units fought against Black soldiers of the French army with a ruthlessness that suggested that no prisoners would be taken. On many occasions, Black prisoners of war were shot, sometimes up to several hundred at a time. He also says, quote, when Germans did not kill Black prisoners outright, they often separated them from the white French captives and subjected them to harsh treatment. Most of these incidents happened during the German offensive against the French defenses along the Somme River, launched on June 5th, 1940, and during the pursuit of the retreating French in the following 2.5 weeks. Random killings, abuse, and neglect of Black Africans continued en route to the gathering places for prisoners and in the German prisoner of war camps. The records in the French Army archives document the killing of approximately 1,500 Black prisoners of war, despite the Geneva Convention, remember. But the fact that these materials are incomplete suggests that the actual number was much higher, perhaps twice as high. So there is so much that we can say and discuss about these incidents, and we can go into detail about our visceral reactions to them during the Q&A if you all would like to. But for right now, I'm drawing attention to them for a few reasons. One, I want to show the prevalence of anti-Blackness in German culture during World War II. Two, I want to show the ways that this anti-Blackness extended far beyond individual actions in everyday society and into actual policies enacted during military campaigns that flouted international law, policies that led directly to mass murder. Three, I want to illustrate the almost complete erasure of these stories from our historical conversations, as these massacres are not typically taught as part of our education about World War II. I know that I personally did not learn about this until I was studying for my PhD, and Scheck's article is one of very few sources about these massacres and about related anti-Black violence during this time. Another wonderful source about anti-Black violence during this time period is one I mentioned and quoted at the beginning, and that is Robert Kesting's 1992 article, Forgotten Victims. So this article presents additional examples of the ways that anti-Blackness was the rule, not the exception, in the World War II era, and how it permeated Nazi military culture and European culture in general. So Kesting's article is quite literally page after page of atrocities committed in Nazi-occupied Europe against Black populations. But I've selected a few examples. And again, these are very horrifying examples, so I understand if people need to take a step back. So the first one is an investigation dated July 4th, 1945, alleged that a Nazi commander in August 1944, near Tours, France, ordered, quote, 100 Negro prisoners of war to be executed once they completed the task of digging their own graves, end quote. So in this quote, we actually see parallels between Jewish prisoners in death camps being forced to dig graves for themselves and their community members before being murdered en masse. And that is a very, very common scene that you will see in Holocaust literature and in Holocaust memoirs. The next example, on December 17th, 1944, in Belgium, 11 Afro-American soldiers were brutally executed and their bodies hideously mutilated before and after the executions. Also in 1944, 2 Afro-American airmen were shot down in Hungary. Upon landing, they were clubbed to death by Hungarian SS troops. Witnesses alleged the reason they were executed was that, quote, Hungarians do not like Negroes. And I selected this quote because it illustrates that while, yes, the murders themselves were by SS troops, the quote by witnesses indicates the ways that anti-Blackness was part of Hungarian culture. They did not attribute the murders solely to the soldiers being Nazi members. They attributed it to anti-Blackness in Hungary, period. The last quote is, on March 28th, 1945 in Germany, a witness alleged, quote, a Negro American airman was brutally executed by the townspeople upon orders issued by the local Gestapo. The method of execution was by dung fork, which is essentially a rake, and other implements. And I chose this example because it was townspeople who committed these murders. And yes, they were on the orders of the Gestapo, but they were civilians. So I know that this might seem as though these are just isolated incidents that a scholar has pulled together, but they're not. They're actually evidence of a brutal system of anti-Blackness. And I've opened with these incidents, or framed the first part of the talk with these incidents, to illustrate that there are tragically countless stories like this that emphasize how rampant anti-Blackness was across Nazi-occupied Europe during the World War II era. These incidents also show the fatal end results of centuries of anti-Black discourse that had circulated throughout Europe and the United States long before World War II. And as I said at the beginning, starting with this shows us the stakes of these conversations. So what was that discourse? What laws, policies, and social conditions led to Black people being dismembered and impaled with rakes in Nazi Germany? And what does the United States have to do with all of these atrocities? So we're going to tackle all of those questions, but let's start with some general background about the Black experience in Nazi Germany that extends beyond individual stories. We have now heard multiple narratives of brutality against Black individuals and groups in Nazi Germany, but what were some of the overarching facts of the experiences of those groups during this time period? One, individuals of African descent living in Germany were socially and economically ostracized. They could not attend university, they lost their jobs, and they sometimes lost their citizenship. Now, this is crucial to note because we must make sure, it is imperative that we make sure that we draw direct connections between discriminatory policies and genocide. As Gregory Stanton notes in his 10 Stages of Genocide document, genocides do not begin with gas chambers. They begin with discrimination and policies such as these that strip people of their rights and their sense of belonging. A second point is that mixed race marriages were forbidden in Nazi Germany, and as we discussed, doctors illegally and secretly sterilized hundreds of Black biracial children and most likely killed many of them who quote unquote disappeared. Black people were also imprisoned or sent to internment, concentration, and death camps. There, they were often subjected to medical experiments. The SS and the Gestapo commonly mistreated Black prisoners of war, as we have seen, working them to death in concentration camps or killing them immediately rather than imprisoning them. And this image is an image of a Black person in a concentration camp, and is actually one of the only known images we have of a Black person in a concentration camp, largely because most of them were killed upon arrival. So how specifically does this anti-Blackness in Nazi Germany relate to the United States? Unfortunately, there are many ways, but I'm going to focus on two: eugenics and Jim Crow race laws. So eugenics, kind of simply described, eugenics is the practice of trying to quote unquote improve the human race by quote unquote breeding out undesirable characteristics, or what the scientists deem as undesirable, such as disability, disease, or certain races. So Francis Galton, who was British and actually the cousin of Darwin, who created Darwinism, coined the term eugenics in the late 1800s. And he advocated that society should promote the marriage of what he felt were the fittest individuals and the most talented individuals by providing monetary incentives for these marriages. Now, before beginning, it is really important to note that before eugenics became known as a movement, before it was even named, enslaved Black women in the United States were experimented upon, and much of what we now know as modern gynecology was actually discovered at the expense of Black enslaved women being experimented upon and often being killed during those experiments. As I said, the term eugenics did not exist at the time, but this experimentation was crucial to what Nazi Germany did later. It was of great interest to the Nazis and other genocidal regimes throughout history. But in terms of the actual definition of eugenics as it arose, let's talk about how it came to be. So as I said, it emerged in the late 1800s through Sir Francis Galton. And in a 2003 article entitled Eugenics and the Nazis, the California Connection, Edwin Black explains how we got from Galton to the United States to Nazi Germany. So Galton's ideas about only the most talented people marrying each other, which to be clear are problematic in and of themselves, but when they were transported to the United States, they became racialized. So in the post-Reconstruction era United States, race and racism were at the heart of much of how the US functioned. So as Black explains, this led to a eugenics movement in the United States, largely rooted in race. Eugenicists desired a world full of blonde-haired, blue-eyed, what they called Nordic people. And they believed that anyone who fell outside of those parameters should either be killed or forcibly sterilized. So as Black notes, the concept of this white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed master Nordic race did not originate with Hitler, despite being most commonly attributed to Hitler. It was created in the United States, and California actually played a crucial role in its cultivation. So Black explains that California was considered an epicenter of the American eugenics movement. He says, and I quote, "Eugenics would have been basically bizarre parlor talk had it not been for extensive financing by corporate philanthropies, specifically the Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman Railroad fortune. They were all in league with some of America's most respected scientists from Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. These academics espoused race theory and race science, and then faked and twisted data to serve eugenics' racist aims. The Rockefeller Foundation helped found the German eugenics program and even funded the program that Joseph Mengele worked in before he went to Auschwitz," end quote. So Mengele is probably the most infamous doctor who experimented on Jewish and other prisoners during the Holocaust. So Black explains that California eugenicists published their work, particularly their work that framed sterilization as a crucial part of this movement, and they gave them to German officials and scientists. And scientists I'm using in quotes because this is not science, this is genocide. So Hitler studied American eugenics closely, and in his autobiography, he quoted American eugenic ideology, but he replaced Nordic with either Germanic or Aryan. During Nazism's early years, eugenicists across America actually celebrated Hitler's plans as Black says the fulfillment of their work, and they funded many of Nazi Germany's experiments. In his 2017 book, Hitler's American Model, James Whitman, Hitler's American Model of the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law, James Whitman, a scholar of the Holocaust and anti-Blackness, presents an incredible detailed investigation of the American impact on the notorious Nuremberg laws. Now, the Nuremberg laws were, as I'm sure many of you know, the 1935 centerpiece of anti-Jewish legislation in the Nazi regime. So Whitman says, America in the early 20th century was the leading racist jurisdiction in the world. Nazi lawyers, as a result, were interested in, looked very closely at, and were ultimately influenced by American race law. And Whitman explains that in particular, Nazis admired Jim Crow era laws that discriminated against Black Americans and segregated them from white Americans. They were also particularly interested in the ways that the US managed to have people living in the United States that they deemed objects, who were Black people, or that they deemed non-citizens, such as Native Americans, Filipinos, and other groups, even though these people lived in the United States or its territories. So these models of non-citizenship influenced the citizenship portion of the Nuremberg laws, which stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship and reclassified them as nationals without rights. Another component of the Jim Crow era that the Nazis translated into Germany were anti-miscegenation laws, which basically prohibited interracial marriage in 30 United States. So Whitman says, quote, America had, by a wide margin, the harshest law of this kind, preventing interracial marriage. In particular, some of the state laws threatened severe criminal punishment for interracial marriage. That was something radical Nazis were very eager to do in Germany as well. So the United States enters the war, and it took a decidedly anti-Nazi stance publicly. And yet, Black American troops noticed similarities between the two countries, between the United States and Nazi Germany, and they confronted them head on with what they called the Double V campaign: victory abroad against the Axis powers and Nazism, and victory at home against Jim Crow. So speaking of Black Americans and their involvement in World War II, what actually happened when Black American soldiers returned home? So let's see. So one of the things that Black Americans had to face when they returned home was lynching. Now, in this 2018 article by Jamil Larty and Sam Morris called How White Americans Used Lynchings to Terrorize and Control Black People, they basically refuse to sanitize the history of lynching. And that is because that history has been greatly diluted in the US education system. So I'm going to read these quotes because they are particularly impactful. So they said, quote, lynchings became widely practiced in the US South from roughly 1877 through 1950. Victims would be seized and subjected to every imaginable manner of physical torment, with the torture usually ending with being hung from a tree and set on fire. More often than not, victims would be dismembered, and mob members would take pieces of their flesh and bone as souvenirs. In the second quote, they note that among the most unsettling realities of lynching is the degree to which white Americans embraced it, not as an uncomfortable necessity or a way of maintaining order, but as a joyous moment of wholesome celebration. Whole families came together, mothers and fathers, bringing even their youngest children. It was the show of a countryside, a very popular show, read a 1930 editorial in the Raleigh News and Observer. In the 1931 Maryville, Missouri lynching of Raymond Gunn, the crowd was estimated at 2,000 people and included hundreds of children. One woman, quote, held her little girl up so she could get a better view of the naked Negro blazing on the roof. After the fire was out, hundreds poked about in his ashes for souvenirs. The charred remains of the victim were divided piece by piece. And there were even postcards that were distributed en masse of lynchings. That's how not only popular they were, but how much they were just part of public culture and something to celebrate. So let's think about not only just how sick this is, period, but the sickening cyclical nature of this. American race law influenced Nazism's race laws. Nazism became such a world threat that the United States entered the war and ostensibly fought Nazism and declared itself a champion of human rights, all while supporting lynching domestically. Black American soldiers who just fought abroad against racism and anti-Semitism returned to the United States and were subjected to the same brutality and murder that inspired the Nazis in the first place and that they had just sacrificed their lives to fight. So by 1951, Black Americans were calling for international help under the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. So it's important to remember that everything we've been talking about was happening during World War II, but the term genocide did not emerge until after World War II. So in December of 1948, the United Nations defined genocide for the first time. It was the culmination of work by a lawyer named Raphael Lemkin. So the convention defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So I read this definition in full because it's important to note that there are many misconceptions about the definition. It is generally thought that for an event to qualify as genocide, the entirety of a group of people, or at least the significant majority, must be annihilated, or there must be a written plan for such total annihilation. But as you can see, that is not the case. Also, despite misconceptions, the actions that qualify as genocide are not just killing members of the group. You have all of these other aspects that count as well. So despite espousing a commitment to anti-genocide and human rights rhetoric, the United States did not ratify the Genocide Convention until 1988. That is 40 years after the convention took place. So Black American communities in particular honed in on this hypocrisy. And there are many ways that we can approach studying how Black communities have grappled with this hypocrisy. But in my research, I focus on the Black press and Black literature. So the Black press was the main source of news about issues deeply affecting Black communities. And I also want to note that the Black press frequently wrote articles denouncing anti-Semitism, both leading up to World War II and during World War II, and urging the United States to act and help Jewish populations. So in the decades following the Holocaust, the concept of genocide was a staple in the Black press. Many newspapers latched onto the term as a potential tool for Black liberation from centuries of violence. So as the Nuremberg trials took place following World War II, there were whispers that there was a new word that might render anti-Black violence and other forms of racist violence illegal internationally. And in what appears to be the earliest mention of the word genocide in the Black press, the Norfolk Journal and Guide published an article in March of 1946 entitled, "Here's a New Word for Your Vocabulary, Genocide." So this is actually a copy of that first article. And apologies for the quality of these newspaper slides. It is one of the most impossible tasks in the world to upload the archives into PowerPoint format based on the way that they are presented in the archive. There's just random white space everywhere. It's very difficult. So this article noted that the word genocide would, quote, outlaw attacks on races if successful. Following this article, numerous other articles were written in the Black press about the concept of genocide. These are just a couple, and I can go back to these in the Q&A if you'd like to look at them a little more. So it became very common in particular for the Black press to conceptualize of lynching as genocidal. And the most explicit and extensive condemnation of the United States treatment of African Americans came in the form of the Civil Rights Congress, also called the CRC, which was an African American civil rights organization, petition in 1951 called "We Charge Genocide, the Crime of Government Against the Negro People." So this is a copy of the front of that petition. And this is a 200+ page document that lists various ways the United States was guilty of genocide against Black Americans, with a primary focus on lynching and other murders that went unprosecuted. And the petition included hundreds of stories of Black American murders via white supremacy. And it's to push for justice for these populations. The authors of the petition argued that these murders were genocide and therefore violated the new international law prohibiting genocide. And their overarching argument is found in this section of its introduction, which explains what I was saying, which is that it is incorrectly thought that genocide must mean the complete destruction of a group. And they perform a close reading of the UN's document and hone in on the "or in part" portion. So these are just 3 examples of murders that they put forward in the petition. And I included these 3 to show the very different types of murders that were part of white supremacy. In this first instance, a Black man refused to remove his hat in the presence of white people and was shot and killed by a police officer. In the second, a Black man bled to death because he was not treated following an automobile accident in a white hospital. In the third, a Black family, including their 2 little daughters, were burned alive in their home because their white neighbors did not want them to move into their neighborhood. So the Civil Rights Congress petition was buried by the white press, but the Black press covered it continually. So here are various articles about the Black press covering the petition. And the petition was essentially dismissed by the United Nations, and then the Black press transitioned to discussing genocide not only as dramatically violent, shocking events such as lynching or burning people alive, but also through a series of unrelenting daily conditions that make survival impossible. So from this time through the end of the 20th century, about 1954 through the end of the 20th century, articles started coming out about multiple forms of oppression against Black populations as genocide, including failing infrastructure, police brutality, the murders of Black revolutionaries, the Tuskegee experiment, and more. Now, the Tuskegee experiment in particular provides one of the clearest examples of links between the United States and Nazi Germany. The Nazis' medical experimentation on Jewish prisoners for supposed scientific developments for the benefit of, quote, Aryan populations are well documented as part of the Holocaust, but their links to the United States anti-Black experiments for the benefit of white populations are less well known, from slavery through Tuskegee. So the Tuskegee experiment lasted from 1932 to 1972. So it began before the Holocaust and continued long after. And in 1932, the United States Public Health Service, working with the Tuskegee Institute, began a study to record the progression of syphilis. It involved 600 Black men, 399 who had syphilis, 201 who did not. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, which is a variety of illnesses. By 1943, penicillin was widely discovered to be an effective treatment for syphilis, but the participants in the study were not offered treatment. And this is where it became a genocidal study. Instead, the researchers continued the study until 1972 to see what happened when the disease progressed so that they could document it to help white communities. When the study was accused of being unethical, researchers continued it anyway with the goal of tracking the participants until all had died. Many of them died, others went blind, others went insane, among other horrific symptoms. Additionally, many participants gave the disease to their wives since they did not know they had it. Then many of these women gave birth to children who were born with a wide range of health issues due to their mothers having syphilis and not being aware of it. So this impacted generations. And this is how the Black press covered it. And I include these articles to show that they did not just talk about the Tuskegee experiment, they talked about it as genocide and they explicitly linked it to the Holocaust. And these are a couple others. You can see death sentence for 400 patients, 400 victims of deadly disease denied cure. And again, in the content of the article, they discuss it as genocide. So as I wrap this up and we think about these connections between Nazi Germany and the United States on a broad level, it is also helpful to think about them on an individualized level. And as I noted at the beginning, I want to talk about stories and their ability to render some of these facts and data visible as personalized stories. So while there are not many Black people who lived in both Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow South, Hans Massaquoi did. And in his memoir, Destined to Witness, Growing Up Black in Nazi Germany, he discusses his experiences in both regimes. So Massaquoi was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1926, the son of a Black Liberian diplomat and a white German nurse's aide. His father returned to Liberia as Nazism began to take over the political climate in Germany, and Massaquoi and his mother remained in Hamburg. His childhood was defined by the singularity of his experience as the only Black child in his town. He was ostracized, ridiculed, and assaulted countless times as a child. He also explains the various instances of violence and interrogation to which he was subjected as an adolescent, including many instances where he was taken to a local precinct by members of the SS for simply existing, for instance, for walking across the street with his white girlfriend. Each time, there was someone in the precinct who decided to let him go free, much to the dismay of whichever Nazi had brought him in with the intention of brutalizing or killing him. In addition to facing these moments of terror, Massaquoi was also denied a slot in his local high school due to his Blackness, despite having some of the top scores in his class. And this affected the trajectory of the rest of his life in Germany in terms of trying to get a job. Massaquoi miraculously survived the war, and the concluding sections of his memoir address his adulthood, first in Liberia for a few years, and then in Jim Crow America, including his service in the United States Army during the Korean War. So Massaquoi was never deployed to Korea, but he ended up spending his service years in the United States South, and that is where he noticed the very alarming similarities between the United States South and Nazi Germany. So he actually ended up becoming a journalist for Ebony magazine, which was a Black magazine, and he often interviewed well-known Black figures such as Martin Luther King and James Baldwin. Also, he wrote many pieces for Ebony magazine about the connections between Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow United States. And he became editor-in-chief of the magazine from 1967 to 1997. So just to conclude, this is him as a young child. This is him in his school courtyard, and he has a swastika sewn onto his sweater. And he actually begged his babysitter to sew that on in the hopes that he would stop being abused by his classmates. And this is him during the Korean War. This is him with his wife, Catherine. This is him interviewing Martin Luther King. This is him in 1996, 1 year before retiring from Ebony. And this is him with Diana Ross. So in conclusion, Massaquoi published his memoir in 1999, and he passed away on his 87th birthday in 2013, leaving us with his extraordinary account that reminds us of the countless individual lives that comprise the experiences of the Holocaust and the African diaspora. His story takes us back to my opening point about how these systems of power uphold each other and therefore can also be dismantled together. Through his work to advocate for both Jewish and Black communities in Nazi Germany and in the United States, Massaquoi emphasizes the importance of interracial and cross-cultural solidarity as crucial tools in building a new world. And for the final slide, as we think about building this new world, I want to conclude with an image of Black-Jewish solidarity today. I know this has been a bit bleak, so I want to end on a note of hope. So during the Black Lives Matter movement, various Jewish organizations across the United States put out this ad in solidarity. This act of solidarity and many others like it, including the Black press articles I mentioned that denounced anti-Semitism during and before World War II, emphasize the importance of telling the stories we've covered today and of encouraging the solidarity those stories can produce. Massaquoi's life, for instance, is the epitome of challenging intersecting forms of racism through storytelling in a variety of ways. Working at Ebony and curating various articles to be published while he worked there, writing articles himself that linked Nazi Germany and the United States, conducting civil rights movement interviews, and finally, in the ultimate act of storytelling, writing his memoir. In understanding Massaquoi's life, the life and murder of Black Germans such as Gilgez, and the lives and deaths of countless other Black people, Jewish people, Black Jewish people, and others who have been attacked by white supremacist oppressive systems, we weave additional threads into the tapestry of understanding the nuances of genocide, racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Blackness, so that we can create a world in which these concepts no longer exist and build a new, equitable, joyful one to stand in its stead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kucik, for this very informative and powerful presentation. We have a number of questions that are coming in from audience members, and I'd like to start with one that came in from one of the participants who asks, did you say that the UN did not consider Jim Crow America genocide, and did they say why?
That's an excellent question. So what the UN did was they dismissed the petition by the Civil Rights Congress. And essentially what happened was that Southern US senators basically said to the UN that the United States was not going to ratify this convention if it included lynching or the Jim Crow South essentially as genocidal, because that would interfere with the process of lynching. So I can actually share my screen quickly and show you, again, these one of these articles in the Black press says, oh, okay. So this one at the top says, Southern salons still blocking votes on genocide convention. This is one of many that talks about the ways that these Southern senators were impacting the United Nations, the way that they were conceiving of genocide and what they were going to actually condemn as genocide. The United States had an immense amount of power following World War II, and they were essentially able to ensure that the Jim Crow South and lynching was not considered. And as you can see, this other article says UN Genocide Pact made law, US didn't ratify it, and it goes into detail about how the United States, these Southern senators wanted to ensure that lynching was not going to be able to be qualified. They also wanted to make sure that the genocide they committed against indigenous populations was not going to be able to be included either.
Thank you. Another question came from Stephanie, and she asks about the photo that you showed earlier of the Black prisoner next to another prisoner who was wearing a concentration camp uniform, and was wondering, do you have any more information about this person, and why is he not wearing a camp uniform?
That's a really great question. I actually am not sure of that off the top of my head. This is something that I had come across when I was studying for my exams as part of my PhD, and it always just absolutely gripped me for so many reasons. And I came back to it as I've been working on my book, but I haven't focused in particular on, I came back to it I revisited it in terms of looking at it again because I was so interested in it, but I didn't do a ton of archival research on the various details of the photo itself, such as that. That said, I do have the sources where I found it, and I could absolutely look that up and send you an email for sure, because that's an excellent question, and I want to know now too.
Yeah, we'll have to do a little more research into it and see what's happening in this photo.
The image is available online as well on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum website, which is really easy to navigate. If you type in Black populations in Nazi Germany, the image should come up relatively quickly as well.
Great. Let's see, another question comes from Ethan, who asks, I was wondering if you knew what the relation was between Nazi Germany and Black people at an international level. Had the Nazis been successful in conquering Europe, did they have plans for African nations?
That is another excellent question. I actually had a part of this talk that was discussing that. So a big turn in genocide studies in academia right now is discussing colonialism as genocide and discussing the ways that Black and brown populations were murdered or were displaced and then ended up dying, which qualifies as murder due to colonialism, and that counts as destroying a group in whole or in part. And so there are many scholars who have been working on the notion that if Africa had been successfully taken over by Nazi Germany sort of in its entirety, even beyond colonialism, that the numbers of murders of Black populations would have been astronomical, because there is evidence that Germany would not have hesitated to kill people en masse. And one of those pieces of evidence is the murder of the Herero populations in Namibia, the Herero and Nama populations, which a lot of scholars are now calling Germany's first genocide. So essentially, in the very beginning of the 20th century, Germany occupied, settled what is now Namibia. And the Black populations there fought back and said, you're not going to just conquer our land. And Germany issued a decree to eliminate all of them, just wipe out the entire population. And over the course of 4 years, at the very beginning of the 20th century, they eradicated 85% of this Black population. And they wrote extensively about their plans to do this and how they were so glad that they were successful in this. And the implication is that they would have done the same in other colonies as well, particularly if any of the people living there fought back, claimed their own land, which isn't to say that other populations didn't fight back. But this was one of the most explicit instances of Black populations saying, you're absolutely not coming here. And Germany responding by completely eliminating them, which even within the scope of the brutality of colonialism, which included many, many murders and rapes, their explicit dictate to the German military to just completely eliminate the populations stood out as particularly what we now call genocidal.
Dr. Kucik, I have one last question for you. Do you have any suggestions, advice or even recommendations for how we might move forward from this place to a more just way of looking at this history, and also a more just way of proceeding?
Yeah, so that's a great question to end with. And I have two sort of main things that I always try to emphasize to my students too. So one is in talking about the history, I think it's so important to remember that this is not about a narrative of competitive suffering, which is why I said at the beginning that my intention here is in no way to decenter anti-Semitism or to diminish the violence that was committed against Jewish populations and to place any sort of competitive hierarchical suffering in place, but rather to create an expanded narrative that better reflects all of the groups that were targeted during genocides like the Holocaust, so that we know how to prevent that moving forward. If we don't know all of the groups that were targeted by various regimes, it's hard to fight that targeting from happening again. So one, I think, is remembering that the intention in these expansions and these expansive conversations has to be to move forward for the betterment of all groups, not for any sort of competitive suffering narrative, which is how it's often twisted when people hear, oh, I want to expand the study of X, Y, and Z. Sometimes people automatically think that you're trying to diminish or decenter other groups. And we have to make sure that it's clear that that's not the case. We're trying to help as many people as possible and honor the legacies and lives of as many people as possible. And two, I highly recommend reading Gregory Stanton's 10 Stages of Genocide, because what it does is show, as I was mentioned briefly in the talk, that genocide did not start. It does not start with gas chambers. It does not start with lynching. It does not start with mass murder. It starts with acts that we can absolutely stop as they happen, such as identifying groups as an outgroup or using derogatory language about a group and making them feel as though they are outsiders, making fun of them, mocking them, circulating propaganda that describes a group in negative ways. In Rwanda in 1994, when the genocide happened there, it so closely mirrored the way that the Holocaust took place. So the Holocaust, so much of the anti-Semitic propaganda described Jews, for instance, as parasites. In Rwanda, the population that was targeted was often described as cockroaches. And it starts with language like that. It starts with letting language like that go, or by circulating it, and things that people might think are harmless. You hear someone say something that you identify as bullying or racist or problematic, homophobic, or any multitude of problematic ways of talking about people. And we let it go because it doesn't seem as though that's not genocide, right? But that's what gets us there. And so I think that one of the key things is intervening early, just no tolerance whatsoever for that type of language, that type of discourse, those types of jokes. It's not funny. It leads to things like the Holocaust, and people think that it's hyperbole to say that, but it's not, it's reality. You can draw a direct line from literature that was published in Europe for centuries preceding the Holocaust and the ways that Jewish people were described to the Holocaust. And you can just draw a direct line from the ways that Black populations were described across the world to colonialism and slavery and even issues that we have today with police brutality, et cetera. So the short answer is intervening early and also mobilizing as communities. Communities have so much power. It is not, we give so much credit and power to the government, and we think that a lot is out of our control, but so much change has been enacted by communities coming together in solidarity, communities from all over, Black and Jewish communities together, disabled communities together, advocating for Black queer populations, all of these different groups, and mobilizing together, whether that's protesting, whether that's telling stories, my favorite thing, writing, publishing, especially now with the internet. We have the ability to self-publish, to tell our own stories, to film things and protest them, and just really hone in on that power that we have and use it to advocate for each other, not just the communities we're part of actively.
This is so important what you said. Thank you so much. You've really reminded us of not only the escalation, but just how we must come together to see that this persecution affects so many different groups, and that advocating for one means also advocating for all. Yeah. Thank you so, so much. It's been very powerful. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions that came in. Dr. Kucik, I'll forward some of them to you. There's some excellent questions for you to respond to. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I was trying to read the questions, so thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for having me, and anyone can feel free to email me if they'd like any of the resources or anything like that.
Wonderful. Thank you to all of our participants for joining in today's program. This program was recorded, and you'll find it on our website starting tomorrow. I want to give a special thank you to Julia Thompson, our education program manager, who's running the technical side of the show, along with Morgan Romero, our museum and education assistant. Also, a huge thank you to our CEO, Dee Simon, and to our entire team, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Richard Green, Paul Regelbrug, Amanda Davis, Katie Lawrence, and Devonshire Lockheed. Please join us next week for the 5th program in our series of Connecting the Holocaust to Today, entitled My Family's Story, Survival, Escape, and Immigration with Daphna Robun. That's on October 19th at 12 p.m. Daphna tells the story of her parents, both natives of Budapest, Hungary. They endured not only the anti-Semitism of pre-war Europe, but also the persecution of the Nazi regime. And you can hear her tell her parents' story. I hope you will join us next week, and thank you again. This concludes our program for today.